Ray, I want to talk about the conflict in Ukraine and Gaza, but before that, we know that Julian Assange is free right now after more than a decade. And how did you find it, Ray?
Nima, I was ecstatic. As you know, Julian is a good friend of mine. Matter of fact, after he was unceremoniously extracted from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, he looked so bad. They wouldn't give him a razor to shave with. He was just so I identified with myself. I identified myself with him as an act of solidarity for 2.5 years. Um, and finally, my wife said, Ray, the surgeon says you have to shave your beard. I was going to get some open heart stuff, so you better shave it. So I shaved it, but then I grew it back. But yesterday, or I guess the day before yesterday, it all came off. That's enough about me. I do have some awful implications I think about. People say, well, this sets a bad precedent, and it does. But Julian is free, and the precedent that the U.S. security forces have already set, torturing this guy for 4 years in Britain's worst prison, and the whole rest of it, scooping him up on false charges of rape. That was the most objectionable thing. In other words, for those newspaper people or journalists or whatever pundits, they've already been taught a lesson, so to speak. So the the effect of just kind of suppressing true information, even if it's classified, that's going to be a long-standing thing, and it's going to take a very courageous person to expose the truth. If they, no matter where they are, or no matter what kind of citizen they are likely to be scooped up and thrown into a place like Belmarsh. So those are my woeful thoughts, but I'm very glad that Julian is free. Talked to his brother, and they're just really so happy. And you probably saw the pictures of he and his wife hugging each other, and their little kids will be there too. So Gabriel, his brother, and John, his father, who are good friends of mine, uh, deserve an awful lot. His mother too, Michelle, in the early years, deserve an awful lot of credit for seeing it through, supporting Julian, as do a lot of us who wouldn't give up. I think the powers that be thought this was one that they'll get tired of. You don't get tired of a person who's a prophet and a person who has extreme courage to do what he did, thinking that he was a journalist, which he was, and that he could not be prosecuted for telling the truth. And he did tell the truth, but he paid a terrible, terrible price. I just hope he's okay. I'm eager to hear from Gabriel or from John as to how Julian's doing now that he's out of this solitary confinement at 23 hours a day.
Yeah. Zelensky, in his briefing in Brussels, he was talking about peace talks. And it seems that they're coming to some sort of sanity after more than 2 years of this conflict. And we've learned, Bloomberg reported that NATO is not capable of providing Ukraine with weapons for years to come. And these are two good signs that are coming out of this conflict in Ukraine. How do you find the current situation? Do you think Zelensky, together with his allies, NATO, are getting to a point that let's go after some sort of political settlement?
Well, Zelensky is very mercurial. I saw that clip. He seems actually quite emotional. And what he says is exactly what's important, where you quoted him as having said that we'll get a new peace plan, a new settlement plan within months, and we'll put it on the table, and we'll see. Maybe we'll have another Geneva or another Swiss kind of conference. Well, that in itself means a lot. That means he's thinking about the Ukrainians who are getting killed, which he mentioned, ones that are getting injured. And it probably is prompted by some advisors more receptive to the more intelligent advisors in Washington. Now, it's a mistake to look at Washington as a kind of united front. There are people that very much would like to get into a war with Russia. I'll say that again. I can hardly hear myself saying that, but there are people in Washington who would very much like to get into a war with Russia. They think that such a war would give Russia a bloody nose and that no one would think of resorting to nuclear weapons. That is so dangerously wrong. Anyhow, there's another coterie of people in Washington that have a little bit more sense. I think maybe the military, if not General Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, then the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other people who realize what the dangers are here, that are saying, well, look, to their counterparts in Kiev, it's not going to last very long. Besides all that money we're giving you, there got to be no weapons getting there before November. So you're going to have to either take more casualties, you're going to have to think about the terms that Putin laid down. Now, there are a couple other things, straws in the wind. As I was doing another briefing, I briefed the president on Tuesdays, and I was briefing President Robert Scheer. This used to be what I did, of course, in the White House back in the 80s. And I was kind of talking about this subject, and lo and behold, like a little notice that the Pentagon spokesman had said that Lloyd Austin had been in touch, had called his opposite number, Belousov, now in Russia, and that they emphasized the need for retaining ties so that they could communicate. Now, hello, I mean, that makes good sense, doesn't it? Especially in this very tense period. But it's the first time that secretaries of defense have talked to each other since 15 March of last year. I think that's the Ides of March, right? Well, the Ides of March was not a good predictor for what was to follow. It just, there was no communication at all. So what's interesting about this? It's pretty clear that the Russians said, look, this is getting out of hand now. We have those casualties on the beach, mind you, near Sevastopol. We're gonna have to answer that. But before we do, we just want to see if you got your heads screwed on right, because we have all manner of things to hurt you with. Now, I'm not going to say A, B, C, and D, but you know what they are. And worst of all, things are not going well for your people in Ukraine. And, you talk about these 2,000-pound bombs that you're denying or holding up for the Israelis. Well, we've got bombs 3 times more powerful, 3-ton bombs, all right? And they're destroying Ukrainian defenses. And even worse, as you know, they would say to the U.S., the electric power without which trains don't move, without which not much happens in Ukraine, that's already been depleted by some 60, 70%. And we used to just hit the switching stations. Now we're attacking the main centers of where the electricity is produced and disseminated. So if you want a really cold fall and a really cold winter, we have the capability now of knocking out the entire electrical power system. So what happens? Well, I think finally those sensible people, it's a stretch to call them sensible, but they're more moderate than the warmongers. They say, well, there's a point there. And, it is a little different. It is a little, what are the Russians going to do now? They say that attack is not going to remain unanswered. What do they mean by that? My God, let's talk to them. And then the question is, whom should we call? Who should call? Now, the Russians are so fed up with Tony Blinken and his duplicity I mean, I refer back to when Biden promised not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine on the 30th December 2021, and then Blinken to Lavrov in Geneva 3 weeks later, the 21st of January 2022, said, forget about that. That's no problem. That's no undertaking. We have the right to put offensive missiles in Cuba, in Ukraine. And, maybe we could talk about limiting the number of them. So Lavrov is just kind of really sick and tired of Blinken. And so who should make this call? Well, they picked Austin because he's the Secretary of Defense. Now, I just repeat that Austin made this call to his opposite number. So it was military affairs they were talking about, okay? And Ryabkov, the deputy, Lavrov's deputy, Ryabkov, said this was a very important telephone call, all right? This is please be aware, we're in touch now, and that's really good. Nothing much more was said except that, yeah, we both appreciate the need to be in touch, okay? Meanwhile, Ryabkov says, hey, you know those 2 destroyers that you said we're going to go into the Black Sea? Don't do it, okay? Don't do it. You told the Turks you're going to go through the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. That's not a good idea. That's not a good idea at all. Cancel that, because we can't be responsible for what happens when you come close to our shores where you have no business being, okay? Whoa, that was Tuesday. Ryabkov has spoken out since then, not specifically on this subject to my mind, but there it stands. And I don't know, I'm not up on the very latest. I don't know what's happening to those 2 destroyers, but there is precedent for this. And I remember this quite well. Often I don't remember why I go into the next room, but I remember what happened in the Black Sea in May of 2021. 2 destroyers were on their way from the U.S. destroyers into the Black Sea. Biden and Putin called, okay? They talked on the telephone, and Putin said, look, very bad idea, very bad idea. You have the British people have been snooping on us within sight of the Black Sea ports. Don't do it. You better turn them around. And besides, we have amassed many forces on the border with Ukraine. So here's Biden, who, if memory serves, made this call because of the concentration of forces on the border of Ukraine. And he said, oh, wow. So you don't, maybe we ought to talk about this. Maybe we ought to have a summit. Yeah, let's have a summit. That's how the summit originated. Okay. Came out of the blue. Biden says to himself, I'm really good at personal relationships here. Let's do a summit and we can, they won't threaten us anymore and we'll be able to sail our warships wherever we want. What did Biden do? He told the Navy, withdraw those warships. I don't want them going anywhere in the Dardanelles or the Bosporus. Now let them go to Greece. It's nicer in Greece. They can have some R&R there on the beaches of Greece, okay? Don't do it. Whoa, that was a big move. What am I saying? I'm saying there's precedent for the president, and even this president, Biden, acting responsibly when he's warned, as he has been warned by the deputy foreign minister, Ryabkov, Tuesday, not to sail those 2 ships into the Black Sea. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe they've already been recalled, or maybe they're on their way in. But this will be a litmus test to see if the U.S. is able to be influenced by stern warnings, and if they're not influenced by stern warnings, what happens to these warships? Just to finish up here, I think there is a glimmer of hope in the fact that Austin called Belousov. I mean, you have to look at that as a sensible move. What happens next with these warships is going to be highly indicative of the mood. And I just finished by saying that Biden is a pretty impulsive guy when he gets on the phone alone. Okay. And I believe he was on the phone alone with Putin when he talked about, well, what are those troops? What are those troops doing on the border with Ukraine? We're worried about that. And Putin said, what about those two warships you have going into the Black Sea? So that's when Biden said, let's have a summit. Now, the summit was a disaster. All we really know about the summit is that Putin had a one-on-one chance to meet Biden, to take his measure, and Biden was saying really untrue things to a fellow who knows the game. The most important thing was that Biden said, I didn't make this up. This is Biden after the one-on-one summit. Biden says, I told Mr. Putin, we know that he's got a really multi-mile border, multi-thousand-mile border with China, and that China, he knows that China aspires not only to be a major economic, but a military power, a strategic rival. So, he's in a tough position. We know that. So I'm not really going to say what exactly I told Putin, but and then they're trying to get him on a plane, right? Come on, Joe, get up. I said, I want to say something else. We know that Russia is being squeezed by China. That's the reality. Okay. Now, Nima, as I've said before in this show, the relationship between China and Russia is the supreme reality, but Biden got it all wrong. And his advisors never awoke to the fact until maybe just the last couple of weeks, okay? But that's the big tectonic shift. It's 2 against 1. And it all became possible to know how naive Biden was and how ill-advised he's been on thinking he could get he could tell the Chinese, don't trade with Russia, don't accept any more oil, don't give them any parts for it, as if the Chinese would say, oh, okay. So it's just the opposite. And the Ukraine thing is that in spades, because we know now that when Putin briefed Xi Jinping on the 4th of February, 2022, Xi Jinping sort of acquiesced in something, 180 degrees away from Beijing's boilerplate principle stand on non-interference in the affairs of other countries, non-violation of borders, and so forth. In other words, Xi Jinping said, and Chinese rhetoric echoed this, look, when you have a core interest and you're a big power and you're being endangered, you do what you have to do. You, quote, evaluate each situation on its own merits, period, end quote. That change in rhetoric and that change in approach by the Chinese showed me and other people who have been around for a while that this was real. The Chinese are going to stand behind the Russians. And that goes in spades now because, China knows. I mean, it's not like China is next. China is first. You read the Pentagon documents and they say our principal rival or principal threat is from China. And so the Chinese know, look, what they're trying to do is get rid of this Russian thing in Europe, and then they can deal with us. And so there's every incentive on the part of the Chinese to make sure that Russia doesn't lose this one. Not that they're helping them a lot. They are economically, of course, by buying so much oil. But militarily, the Russians are up to it quite by themselves. And that's the bottom line here. People say, how will Putin decide to respond to this killing of 6 now, or 2 of them, 4 of them children, on Children's Day, Trinity Sunday at the beach? Well, Putin was expected to respond more forcefully to the killing of all those people at that concert, right, a couple of months ago. And he did. And he is doing it. And how he's doing it, in my view, is by dropping these 3 tons, right? 7,000-pound bombs on Ukrainian concentrations on the western side of the battle line, and that he really and truly is trying to limit Russian fatalities, Russian wounded and killed. And by doing this, by drawing the Ukrainian reinforcements into a firing field, as they did in Bakhmut, as they did in Avdiivka, they're doing what Putin said originally they wanted to do, demilitarizing Ukraine. And the next step, of course, is to denazify Ukraine. And that's going to take a lot more time. But my bottom line is that Putin's in the driver's seat here. He's not going to be easily provoked by this kind of thing. And lastly, and this is my own opinion from having looked at all the evidence that I have access to, it doesn't appear that the Ukrainians are really shooting at that, really firing at that beach. We know that there were 5 ATACMS missiles. 4 of them were downed on their way into that airfield there north of the beach. This other one apparently was struck by anti-aircraft or rocketry and spilled its bomblets, as terrible as these things are, in the water and on the beach. Now, what's interesting to me is that Putin knows that, if I'm right, Putin knows this too. On the other hand, he knows that, if this happens, the U.S. is at least partly responsible for the U.S. programs these ATACMS missiles and has all kinds of satellite data going into the programming. So he had a choice, or maybe he didn't. What I'm saying is he could have said, look, this is awful. We know that the residue of what we knocked down, that 5th ATACMS, went on the beach and killed some people. That's careless. That's reckless in the extreme. Don't do it again. He had that option. He didn't take it. And this worries me because he's under a lot of pressure. Little kids killed on Little Kids' Day, Trinity Sunday in Russia, okay? The talk shows, Solovyov and the others say, now we ought to flatten Kharkov. Oh, no, flatten Odessa or decimate Kiev. That's the kind of thing Russians are hearing on their talk shows. So I think Putin said, well, even if it was largely a mistake, as largely a discharge of these bomblets because we shot it almost down as the other 4. I don't have the option of not blaming the Americans. And so the blame was very squarely put, not only on the Ukrainians, but first and foremost on the Americans for giving them these missiles, for programming them the way. And I'm sure that even if they thought it was not really programmed to hit the beach, it did hit the beach. And so it was reckless in the extreme. And Putin didn't have much option other than to say precisely that. Now, this new talk between Defense Secretary Austin and Belousov, the defense minister in Russia, that I think obviously comes in the wake of that incident and in the wake of the clear threats by Russia to not leave that kind of thing unanswered. And curiously enough, now that I recall, a day before, Austin called Belousov, Lavrov was asked, hey, this fellow Seymour Hersh, he says that there are underground talks going on, that there are what we call back channel talks going on between the Russians and any truth to that? And Lavrov says, "Niet, no contact, no talks." Next day, Austin called Belousov. So at the risk of accentuating the positive, at least they're in touch. The defense ministers are in touch. And hopefully that will tamp down more extreme action on the part of the Russians. My own view is that that Putin would not let himself be provoked by this one incident to do much more than what he's already doing in Ukraine, perhaps faster, and perhaps with the risk of losing more Russian troops than he really wishes to.
Yeah. If they want to go after some political settlement, Ray, we know that they're talking about the United States together with Ukraine and Israel. They're talking about 8 Patriot systems from Israel to go to the United States, then send them to Ukraine. If they want to negotiate with Russia, why do they need to send more weapons to Ukraine? Because we know that Russia was talking about demilitarizing Ukraine and denazifying Ukraine. They have to show that they're not looking after some sort of building up as they were doing during the Minsk II, that later on Angela Merkel and Holland were talking about that we are building Ukrainian army to fight Russia. And right now it seems if they continue doing this, if they send more weapons, it seems in the eyes of Russians would be they want to escalate the war in the near future.
Well, that's right. I again refer to the more moderate people in Washington, the ones that have told Biden, look, maybe you ought to be a little more careful. Okay. Now, they are usually outweighed by the warmongers, okay, by the Tony Blinkens and the Anthony Blinkens and Sullivan, okay, and Noland, who still lurks around the corner. They still have a ladies' room for her in the West Wing. Now, there are counterindications to this little glimmer of hope. One is the Patriots, but the Patriots have been extremely vulnerable to Russian targeting. At one point, the Russians provoked a whole Patriot battery to shoot up assault missiles, and when it pinpointed the place where they're shooting from, boom, that was the end of that battery, okay? So I think this has mostly to do with the election, to appear strong before the election in November in the U.S. And another symptom of that would be this press report, still unconfirmed. They say that Biden really hasn't made his mind up yet, but this usually presages that his mind be made up, of putting self-declared contractors from the United States in Ukraine. So contractor boots, not military boots, mind you, just contractor boots on the ground. So that when the Russians destroy a missile battery, that what's left of it can be repaired or at least disposed of. Now, that's new. That's just a couple days old. What are the Russians to think about that? Is that some sort of conciliatory measure? Well, no. That's always accompanied by pledges not to put boots on the ground, right? Like boots with uniforms on top of them, right? So it's hard to read this except in the context of what I was saying. There's a yin and a yang. There are people who really want to risk a war with Russia. The more so because if they don't appear really tough, they're going to lose the election, right? That was very clear last night when there was this debate between Trump and Biden. Matter of fact, maybe this deserves a comment. I was not surprised, but I was saddened by the fact that Biden is still operating out of the late 40s, like the late not 1840, the late 1940s, okay? When we were supreme, when America was the most powerful country in the history of the world, right? We've seen that before. He said that a couple of times last night, we're America. We're the most powerful country in the history of the world. He said, I think twice or three times, I forget how many. Well, that's his paradigm. That's the way he approaches this thing. It's delusional. And who's to tell him any different? Well, I don't think Austin has it in him to tell him anything different, but Austin does represent the military. And he has to tell them what General Brown is telling him, and that is, look, this is getting really, really dangerous, okay? The Russians, for the first time ever, have been raising the notion of tactical nuclear weapons. Actually, they're exercised them. My God, we don't want to get into this any deeper than we're already in. So let's pull our punches. Now, the other thing I just mentioned when I'm talking about the debate last night, it was so sad, you know. Here's Biden saying, "Look, the Russians, they're going to take Ukraine, and after Ukraine, Poland mentions Poland by name, right? Other countries, the rest of Europe, right? What's that all about?" Well, that's what the neocons are telling him. And he doesn't have enough sense to realize that's a con. That's a neocon con, all right? Now, you don't have to go very deep to prove that's a con. Here's, let's see, the beginning of 2022. Fiona Hill, Russia expert supreme, trained under arch Russophobe Richard Pipes at Harvard. A long story I can tell you about how I escaped Richard Pipes, but that's a different matter. I was headed toward there, and I decided, no, I'd like to get married. Anyhow, so she's trained by this Russophobe. So in January, late January of 2022, she says, what Putin wants, New York Times op-ed, what Putin wants is to shove the United States out of Europe and say, don't let the door hit your backside on the way out. Fiona Hill, op-ed, New York Times, 20-something January 2022, okay? So what happens? There's a great graphic in the Times. It shows Putin closing the door and all the recent U.S. presidents going like this, slinking away. So that's what the Russians were after. Get everybody out of Europe, or get the U.S. out of Europe. Okay, now, so what happens? We have the special military operation starts just a month later. And then just a couple months after that, Fiona Hill and one of her colleagues, remember her name in a second, publish a big article in Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs, the quintessential establishment periodical, and they say, hey, we just learned that there was a deal, that the Russians decided that they would have a ceasefire if Ukraine agreed to remain neutral. And that was right on the point of signature. It had been initialed, and they're going to put more sticky problems like Crimea and the Donbass off to the side. And the Russians are going to offer Ukraine, did offer Ukraine security guarantees by the major five powers and so forth. That was on. It was just, and it was ended by Boris Johnson, who came in early April, saying, no deal, no, keep fighting. Now, so wait a second. Here's Fiona Hill. January, let's say this was, I think, September, okay? September, she knows that she was wrong in January, that it's not that Putin wants to drive the U.S. out of Europe. It's not that Putin won't stop with Ukraine. Putin has already stopped, by God's sake, okay? He stopped at the negotiations in Istanbul, okay? Now, the main negotiator on the Ukrainian side, Arachmania is her name, okay? Best friend with Zelensky, head of Zelensky's faction in the Narada, in the Ukrainian parliament, okay? He's named by Zelensky to do this negotiating. Now, Nima, when do you suppose they decided to name this very trusted negotiator to deal with the Russians. Well, I'll tell you, 4 days after the invasion, the date was 28 February 2022. In other words, the Russian forces scared the bejesus out of the Ukrainians. The Russians made it clear they're willing to negotiate. They don't want to take over all of Ukraine. They just want denazification as well as demilitarization. They want a deal, and they'll do a ceasefire. Okay, so Arachmania goes up to Belarus, starts negotiations. They wind up down in Istanbul, and on the 29th of March, they initialed this thing, okay? And then Boris Johnson came in and put the kibosh on it. Now, how do I know that? Arachmania has said so. It was in the Kiev Post, November of last year. But Nima, those of us who are trained in media analysis as well as these other kinds of analysis, we read everything. We have to know what's being said. And we knew back in March and April of 2022 that Johnson had put the kibosh, had said, no, don't negotiate. We want to fight, and we'll give you everything you need for as long as you need it, okay? We knew that. From what? From Ukrainskaya Pravda, the main newspaper there in Kiev. So we knew that. It was very clear. It's just that Americans don't know that. Last thing about this, which I think is important. Americans still don't know anything about this. Now, Putin, I've never really understood why, but I know from past experience that this is the way he acts. He doesn't lay all his cards out on the table right away. If he's got grievances or he's been double-crossed, he doesn't call out the double-cross right away. He waits months. And in this case, in that major speech he made on the 14th, really major speech, people should read it, he goes chapter and verse about how those negotiations were promising, how it was a deal signed, and how the West intervened and said no. And that's why, well, in a word, that's why you have 500,000 young Ukrainian men dead now, okay? So he laid that all out. Now, that was the first time that in so authoritative a way that had been laid out in some detail. And who's more authoritative than Putin? So what does the New York Times do? Oh, it turns out they had various texts of this agreement. They've had it for months, okay? Now it's in the air. Was this agreement real? Well, the New York Times 2 Saturdays ago obfuscates the whole thing. They print the various texts and then they talk all around it and never once mention that the deal was made. Now, I think I still have this headline. Oh, here's the headline. Ukraine-Russia peace is as elusive as ever. Okay. Well, yeah, it's as elusive as ever when the West welched on the deal in March, April 2022. And the reason it's elusive is because the West came in and said, no, we would prefer to use Ukraine as a way to weaken Russia. We know this is going to work. I don't know who advised Biden about that, but this has got to work because we're the most powerful country in the world. I guess that's why it works. And of course, it hasn't worked. So all I'm saying here is that this key fact in all this, there were 2 items on that Saturday, all laid out, but no mention of Boris Johnson, no mention of Russian intervention, of U.S. intervention, saying, no, we can't have a ceasefire. We can't have Ukraine neutral. They have to become part of NATO. And that's the fly in the ointment, of course. And Blinken is still saying, oh, yeah, they'll be part of NATO. We'll have to see. I think it's the 9th of July, so just 10 days later or so, when the NATO summit happens, the big anniversary summit happens in Washington. What will they say about Ukraine membership in NATO? Well, they keep it hanging in the air. in my view, they won't say, "Oh, well, it will happen on a date certain," but so long as they keep insisting that this is their one of their desires or objectives, well, the Russians are going to just keep hammering away and killing more Ukrainian people, and of course, the Russians are suffering casualties as well. People say, "Why aren't they going more? Why aren't they going faster?" I mean, they have the capability, for God's sake. They could obliterate with these 6,000-pound bombs, for God's sake. Well, Russian casualties have been kept to a bare minimum. I don't know what they are, but they're much less than the Ukrainian casualties, probably 7 times less. Okay, a figure that I comes out of what I've read. So this is the way he tends to proceed, Putin and his advisors, and I think so far he's been able to ward off the people that want to level Kharkov or Kiev or Odessa. Matter of fact, what I've been trying to suggest is what I've always suggested. There is flexibility in Russian terms, and specifically with respect to Odessa. The Russians quite know that Odessa is necessary for Ukraine to be a viable country. Otherwise, they're just a breadbasket for the rest of Europe. So Ukraine needs access to the sea. There's got to be a way to work this out, but you don't work this out by shouting at each other. You work it out by high-level contacts and then getting together. So there again, with Austin calling Belarus, I think that may be a harbinger of more high-level contact. And my God, that's what we need. More immediately, what is Biden going to do this time? Is he going to tell the Navy, pull those ships back? Or is he going to say, sail them right into the Black Sea, and we'll see who's boss around here? The latter will be very dangerous in my view, because then I think they'll be sitting ducks. And the British came very close to having one of their frigates sunk just 3 years ago. That could happen, and if that happens, of course, there are people in the White House that would just as soon it happen. My God. But I don't think Biden in his right mind. Biden in his right mind. Well, those of you who've seen the performance last night have to wonder whether Biden's mind is as frail as his body, and whether he needs help, as he did getting off the stage from wife Jill, whether he needs help making these decisions. And I'll just end with saying that is a big fly in the ointment, because here's Putin riding high in Ukraine, ready to retaliate in some, in my view, measured way. But his advisors are saying, who has their fingers on those nuclear codes? Do you think Biden remembers the combination? Do you think maybe he's given it to one of these crazies like Blinken or Sullivan? We have to be on high alert, Mr. Putin, because we don't know what's going to happen. You said, Mr. Putin, you prefer, above all, predictability on the part of a U.S. president. We've never seen any situation as unpredictable as this. Even Ronald Reagan, who famously said in 1983 that we're the evil empire, and pretended there was a mic on when it should have been, in 30 seconds, we're going to attack Russia or something. In other words, even Reagan was willing to listen to people like Secretary Shultz and Vice President Bush, whom I know personally, were urging caution on him and doing battle with these warmongers like Weinberger and others to say, look, there's a better way out of here. And so when the balloon went up, literally, in November of 1983, you had Reagan having called Russia the evil empire. You had very aged and infirm Russian leaders, Andropov for one, Chernenko for another, you had the killing of over 200, I think 269 people on the KAL shot down over Siberia, Korean Airlines flight 007. It was off course, was over Russian territory. And so it was the fighter pilot got the order, shoot it down, and he did. So did the Russians shoot down that plane, killing 290 civilians? Yes, they did. Did they know what they were doing? No, they didn't. It was dark. The pilot said, I can't identify this aircraft. And just hours before, an RC-123 had been through there, or 135, I guess, had a reconnaissance aircraft, and they thought it was another reconnaissance aircraft. So, yeah, they shot it down, but it was not, as it was presented in the UN, a deliberate attack on a civilian aircraft. So all this is going down. Evil empire, okay? You got KAL 007. And then there's this big exercise in November of 1983. Able Archer was its code name. And it involved the president and the vice president and all the main authorities in a nuclear scenario where they were going to rehearse what they would do in a nuclear attack against Russia. And the Russians, of course, had information about all this, not only from their spies, but from electronic. The whole thing was pretty clear, and they thought it was the real thing. Okay. Now, the reason I mention all this is that relations had sunk to a very low level, almost as low as they are now. Okay. There was no attempt at the time by the U.S. to foment a war by proxy against the USSR at the time. None. Okay. So let's see what happens. The Russians think that it's the real thing. People in the White House, they're not really worried. My colleague, my good friend Mel Goodman, with whom I worked for 30 years, okay, saw what was happening and gathered one or two of his friends and said, we have to get the White House to realize the Russians think this is the real thing, for God's sake, okay? So who do they go to? They go to Bobby Gates. Now, Bobby Gates worked with Goodman when I was the branch chief of that branch way back in the 70s. Now Gates is put in charge of all this stuff. So it's not like they didn't know each other. Goodman and company go to Gates and say, look, Bobby, the Russians think, please tell we have to tell the White House to stand down, or at least to tell them it's not the real thing, okay? And I said, come on, give me a break. Russians are just make them believe. And incidentally, in his book, Bobby Gates is his memoir, he famously states that it was never on the top of my list to make the Russians happy or to make the Russians relax. Never on top of my to-do list. Anyhow, so that's Gates. So what did Goodman and his two friends do? They went around Gates, they went to the director's office, and they went to Director Casey and said, look, we're going out of order here, but Gates wouldn't listen. Would you please call the White House and tell them to tell the Russians it's okay. We're not going to have the president or the vice president involved anymore. It's okay. It's just a simulation. Okay. Now, Casey did so right on the phone and called the National Security Advisor, and they tamped it down. Now, we know from a Russian spy, actually, it was run by the British at the time, Gordievsky, that the word had gone out to KGB people that this was the real thing. So be prepared. We might have, this may be the end of things. Okay. So that's how close we came. That was November 1983, with all these things going on, including Evil Empire, including the KAL 007, and then including Able Archer, the exercise. And it came out okay. By God's grace, or by Mel Goodman's guts. That's what it came out all right at. I was briefing at the time. I knew very little about this, but Goodman and all those people had the data. So what am I saying? I'm saying now relations are even more acerbic with the U.S. trying, in Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's words, we're going to, quote, move heaven and earth to give Russia a strategic defeat in Ukraine, period, end quote. Wow. Oh, was that an idle comment? No, that was from the rostrum at some big NATO meeting. When was it? Almost 2 years ago now, for God's sake. So, I mean, here are Putin's advisors saying, oh, is he bluffing? Oh, so that's why they're in Ukraine. Of course, that's why they're in Ukraine. And that's why they can't afford to lose before the election. Problem is, as I've been telling people, Putin has every opportunity to make, to make it appear and to flesh out reality that this is a definitive win in Ukraine. And he can do that before November. Now, will he do that before November? I don't know. Does he want the Biden's competitor to be in charge? I doubt that's first on his list. I mean, if he's interested in predictability on the part of a candidate for president, well, that would be a problem, it seems to me. And that's why I thought from the outset with this Russiagate and all this business, there was a real stretch of the imagination to think that Putin and associates would ever prefer Trump over Hillary Clinton. Did they like Hillary? Of course not, but she was predictable. Okay, so end of that. But I just in comparing those two times, it seems to me that the U.S. should acquire a couple of people that are around. Maybe put Mel Goodman on contract and have him explain what he had to do to reassure the Russians this was not the real thing. Get people around that are wise enough to realize what's happening. And that, I think, is probably the big difference between Vietnam in the 60s, 70s, Russia in the 80s, and now. And what I'm referring to, of course, is there are no wise men. There are no people who are allowed access to the White House that know anything about anything that happened over the last couple of decades. And that's really mischievous because we've seen where Blinken and Sullivan have led us. Most important, as I said before, they've led us into a situation where it's 2 against 1. And now, with North Korea bound by defense treaty to Russia, I'd say it's 2.5 against 1.
Yeah. Ray, talking about the conflict in Gaza, we've learned that the United States is moving troops towards Israel and Lebanon to evacuate in case of escalation. And they're talking about in the coming weeks, Israel is planning to attack Hezbollah. And how do you find the current phase of the conflict in Israel? Do you think that the Biden administration would let Netanyahu to do that?
Very good question. We have a personal negotiator on that job. His name is Amos Hochstein. And unlike Blinken, unlike Sullivan, unlike Biden, he served in the military. You know what's common, Nima? You know which military? He served in the Israeli Defense Forces. Okay. He's an Israeli citizen as well as a US citizen. That gives you some feel for what kind of people are negotiating, so to speak, on our side. Now, what is Hochstein telling the Lebanese? What is he putting about out there? He's saying, look, IDF, they make their own decisions. They say they've got a planned operation against you guys, and that could be real trouble, but we can't do anything about it. Huh? Now, if that's the attitude, if we're not restraining And how successful have we been in restraining Netanyahu and coterie so far? Not very, right? If we're not able or willing to restrain him, what's going to happen? Well, the operational plan against Hezbollah, desperate as it is, Hezbollah being armed to the teeth now with missiles that you wouldn't believe, the accuracy and their number, the Israelis will attack Hezbollah. Why? To win? No. They attacked them in 2006 and got a really bloody nose, okay? They're not going to win unless the U.S. comes in to help them. Now, that's the name of the game here, you know. How can Biden refuse to help us in an election year when he's so dependent on AIPAC money and the Israel lobby? Come on, he'll have to do this. I think that's a supreme miscalculation. Well, hey, who am I to say that? Let me rephrase it. I think that Netanyahu believes that, and that it may not be a miscalculation because I think it might happen. So, you know, it doesn't matter whether I think that's sensible or not. It matters what the perception is. If Netanyahu is on the ropes, as he is in Gaza, as he is in politically in West Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, with the Supreme Court also just accusing him of more crimes. He's going to be in prison if he doesn't stay in power and win this one somehow. So that enters into the equation as well. So I think that's Netanyahu's calculation. Will there be any good sense on the part of these more moderate people in the White House or the State Department or the Defense Department on this one? You know, on this one, I don't think there are any more moderate people. There are some moderate people who quit the State Department and other agencies because of the genocide in Gaza. So this is the more labil. This is the more tentative or dangerous situation, seems to me. And unless Netanyahu is disabused of the notion that he should attack Hezbollah, Hezbollah has the capability now, and they've shown it. They've run drones over key Israeli facilities, and they have, with pinpoint precision, they can attack Israeli targets, including cities. Israel, of course, is a very small nation. They're very vulnerable. Now, would Hezbollah need Iran to come in? No. Okay, Iran has already come in, and others have armed Hezbollah to the teeth over the last decade. Okay, so if Netanyahu is contemplating getting the U.S. involved, not only against Hezbollah with all these troops they've got now in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also against Iran, well, I hope that he's miscalculated on that score, because not even the U.S. wants to get involved with Iran. Iran doesn't want to get involved with the U.S. militarily. And besides that, U.S. forces are stretched so thin now, Nima, not only in Europe, but in East Asia, in the Pacific, and even against, look, the aircraft carrier, Eisenhower, that was over there for 9 months, okay, and patrolling the Red Sea against the Houthis, the Houthis, without apparent success, that's gone back to Norfolk. How many other carriers do they have? Last count, I thought there were 8 or so, 9 maybe. Oh, where are the others? Well, most of them are in dry dock, but they're going to be repaired, or one's in Yokosuka, Japan, one's in the Mediterranean. Well, not only that, but aircraft carriers are sort of, they're outmoded. They're a thing of the past. The thing that they present is a very, very lucrative and dangerous target with 5,000, 6,000 people aboard. All the Houthis would have to do is have real luck with some missile that penetrates a target like an aircraft carrier, and the flag would be up for some kind of escalation. So The Houthis aren't going to stop. Hezbollah is not going to stop. Uh, the Egyptians and the Turks and other people, even the Saudis, they have big Palestinian populations. They are themselves very chary of unrest among those populations, and they'll make compromises just to stay on the good side of the U.S. economically. But whether they will be forced by their populations, most of them work in the oil fields, by the way, by their populations to support Palestine in a more aggressive way, uh, that's still problematical. They have been the missing element, of course. Turkey's talked a big game, but done relatively little. And Egypt needs the U.S. and IMF support so much that their hands seem to be tied. The Saudis are playing a double game. So we'll see how that. But you have the Houthis and you have Hezbollah, you have Hamas. I don't think Netanyahu is going to make it through this, but the problem is, will he make it through November? And I would guess, just a guess, that he probably will, because Biden feels that it's so exigent that he keep the support of the Israel lobby if he has any prayer of having a win in November. And I'll just tack on the thought that after last night's appearance, where it was interesting, Nima, not only during the debate, but CNN kept the camera on to make sure that everybody could see that Jill Biden, Joe's wife, had to come up and hold him by the arm to negotiate some very small steps and lead him away. That's interesting. Now, CNN arranged this whole thing. The people who work for Biden blessed it. You wonder whether they knew that this would be a disaster, and perhaps persuade Biden to say, okay, I need to spend more time with my family. Hunter is in need of my companionship, and so I think that I should yield to someone else. Maybe that's what these people who collaborated with CNN had in mind, because they had to know. I mean, he'd been rehearsing all week up at Camp David. They had to know that this was not a winner for Biden. So we'll stay tuned here. Kamala Harris, my goodness, I don't know, but it may be a anybody but Biden sort of thing. We'll have to see how that works out.
Yeah. Amazing the point you brought up about how CNN was treating Biden at the end of this debate. And they were talking, that their analysts were talking about that Biden was awful. And everybody knows that. But this is the first time that we're hearing that they are really analyzing the situation in the way that we saw it. And
Yeah.
it seems that Ray, do you think that they're looking for replacing Biden at the convention or even before convention?
Well, I'm not an expert in domestic politics, so I'm just guessing, and my view is worth no more than anyone else's. But I find it suspicious, frankly, that CNN would leave the camera on, for example, that CNN would orchestrate this whole thing on terms that they had to know. They're pretty sophisticated people, how poorly the president would do. And so, who are the people running the Democratic Party? The same people running it in 2015, 2016, that put Hillary Clinton up and were sure she was going to win. So the power brokers are the ones that decide these things. Biden apparently, they asked him, "Sure, I can do this. I'm fine. I'm fine. You just don't worry about it." Well, he wasn't fine. So there are some people that profit from this, a cui bono, you could say in this case, who profits from Biden making himself look like he did last night? Maybe they have another candidate in mind. On the other hand, Biden is famously stubborn and convinced that he's not only powerful, but head of the most powerful country in the history of the world, as he puts it. So dislodging him and dislodging the people around him, which would also be necessary, is going to be a problem. But what is it? It's just June, for God's sake. So maybe that's one reason they persuaded CNN to have this early enough so that Biden, having shown his mettle, so to speak, the Democrats would have a chance to figure out what to do before the convention, and that's what we'll see in the next few weeks. Meanwhile, as I always come back to, put myself in Putin's place and his advisors, and they're being convinced, and Putin has said this numerous times, that foreign and military policy by the United States is all conditioned, is all formed on the basis of domestic political considerations. So what does that mean with respect to Ukraine? Or what does that mean with respect to supporting Israel in an open war against Hezbollah? What does that mean in terms of sailing warships, not only into the Black Sea, but into the East China Sea and between Taiwan, the Straits of Taiwan? So the U.S. is obviously overextended, and as much inclined as Biden is to beat his breast and say we are the most powerful country, that ain't so anymore. The rest of the world recognizes that. Just a matter of whether there are enough Democrats that are so fearful that they'll lose the election if Biden stands as the nominee, that maybe they'll do something sensible, more sensible than letting him continue the way he's been doing. I don't know if there's going to be a second debate or not. I thought that there was a date agreed for a second debate, but somebody last night was saying, well, maybe Trump will say that's enough. When he was talking anymore with this guy. So it was quite remarkable. I don't usually watch CNN, right? But it did last night because they were running the show.
Yeah.
And their commentary following, you got Dana Bash's husband, whatever his name is, and all kinds of people commentating. It was universal that this was really a disaster. And people were just complaining, oh, I love Joe Biden, but it's so sad to see this happen. So there was almost unanimity there. And the best anybody could say was, this is what Kamala Harris said later, that, look, you haven't seen him in one-on-ones and how he's negotiated with other people. Well, yeah, we haven't seen that. My God, we hope that's better, but who's to decide on that? So, yeah, so that's the fly in the ointment. Meanwhile, Putin and Xi and the North Koreans and everybody else have to keep their powder dry because there's no telling what these guys will do. And, when you talk about nuclear weapons, I have to just say that I've been around quite a while, okay? And I've never seen us closer to a nuclear exchange. And why I say that is this. The Russians, uncharacteristically, I would say unprecedentedly, said, we're going to exercise tactical nuclear weapons. Okay. And they did in Belarus. So they exercised the tactical nuclear weapons. Now, that's not been done before, at least not announced like that. And so what are they trying to say? I think, and this is my speculation based on decades of experience with the Russians, I think they're trying to say, look, we warn that we have strategic equality and that we can destroy each other's country and the rest of the world. But bear in mind, we also have these tactical nuclear weapons, okay? You have them too. And we are afraid that you will think it necessary to use yours to reverse the trend of events in Ukraine. because, Mr. President Biden, that's the only option you have to avoid a definitive loss before the election. And so we're just trying to remind you that we have these tactical nukes as well. We don't want to use them, okay? But we have them. And if we find that our national sovereignty or our territorial integrity is being threatened, and we're prepared to use them, you need to remember that. Now, I'll just say one more thing on this issue. And this goes back to when John Kennedy made that wonderful speech and said, look, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I was majoring in Russian at the time, Russian area studies, culture, as well as language and history and politics and economics and the rest of it. And that was my call. Okay, I came down to Washington 2 years later, and after my Army service, I worked for the CIA. So what Obama said just before he died, he said it on June 10th, 1963, died November 22nd, 1963. I had just entered the CIA on contract from the Army, okay? And Obama got up at American University and he said a whole bunch of very understandable things that the military was up in arms against. They wanted to nuke the Russians before the Russians nuked us. How many casualties would we have, military? No, probably just 20 million, 30 million, but they'd have more, okay? That's the craziness. Oh, and Obama, Kennedy warned about that. Now, what am I saying? Kennedy said lots of things in that wonderful speech. I recommend it to everyone. But he also, what I'd like to quote here, he said, look, the one thing that we have to, in all events, avoid is in relations between two nuclear powers, giving one side a choice between humiliating retreat and using nuclear weapons. Okay, so just think about it. A choice between defeat, humiliating defeat, and using nuclear weapons. Now, how did that work out? Well, up until the Biden administration, we did that. Russia is a nuclear power. And now we have the Secretary of Defense threatening to give them a humiliating defeat. He said, we're going to move heaven and earth to give Russia, he didn't say humiliating defeat, a strategic defeat. Okay. So what's that all about? That's about these young advisors that don't know that since the Cold War, since Russians got the bomb, for God's sake, we were careful, the US on one side, the Russians on the other, not to face the other with a humiliating defeat or choice between humiliating defeat and using nuclear weapons. So that's where we are now. And will Biden and his coterie of advisors be smart enough to realize that this is what's at stake here now? I don't know. But it doesn't matter what I know. It's what Putin and his people think. And they have to be on edge watching what's going on in Washington today.
Yeah.